Welcome back to our series of audio lessons on the book of Esther. Today we'll look at chapter 5. Before we get into chapter 5, let's take a quick look at what happened in chapter 4. As a result of Mordecai's refusal to bow to Haman, Haman devises a plot to have all the Jews killed. He really wants Mordecai, but I think he extends it to all the Jews just because of the Amalekites' ancient hatred of the Jews. Haman tricked Xerxes into issuing a decree for the Jews' destruction. This certain people can't be tolerated. The date set for the action is still 11 months away, but for the Jews, there's no time to lose. Making a mournful spectacle of himself, Mordecai leads the Jews of Susa to the king's gate wearing sackcloth and ashes, the traditional garb of mourning and repentance. Through go-betweens, Mordecai makes known to Esther the gravity of the Jews' plight, producing a copy of the edict as proof, telling Hathach, her eunuch, to explain it to her and to make her understand what's going on here. Esther, at first, either does not know what to do or is reluctant to act, or both. She basically says, I can't go before the king unless he calls for me. Mordecai, sensing Esther's reluctance, convinces her to plead for her people with 3 sobering truths. Number 1, don't think that just because you're the queen and live in the palace that you will escape. You're still a Jew, and somehow that will be revealed, as if somebody doesn't know already, and you will suffer the same fate as the rest of the Jews. Number 2, if you don't step up and act, another deliverer will arise, and you and your family will perish. And we talked about how perish can mean either to be killed or to be forgotten. And number 3, who knows if you have been placed where you are at this time for just such an action to save the Jews. We talked about this Hebrew idiom not expressing doubt or uncertainty as it might with us, but rather it expresses a truth in the form of a rhetorical question. This is done to keep the speaker from a presumption of knowing the mind of God or speaking on his behalf. Esther resolves to go to the king. If I die, I die. These are not words of defeat or resignation, but of trusting submission to God, regardless of the consequences. But before she approaches the king, she asks Mordecai and the Jews of Susa to join her in a 3-day fast. We discussed how prayer always accompanies fasting. We didn't talk much of this earlier, but Esther is remembered for one event in her life recorded here in God's Word. Her name is not even mentioned in the Persian Chronicles. The sense of Mordecai's word is, you may have been placed here just for this reason. Can we make that personal? God has placed us where we are and when we are for a reason. Paul at the Athenian Areopagus in Acts 17:26 says, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and boundaries of their dwelling place. It may be for only one action, possibly one that seems to us insignificant, that we are remembered. Now, I'm not suggesting Esther's actions before Xerxes were insignificant, but think of all the little insignificant coincidences that had to occur to get Esther where she was, when she was. We should be watchful of the opportunities to do even the seemingly insignificant things. Jesus spoke of the importance of the little things in Matthew 10:42. And whoever gives one of these little ones even a cup of cold water because he is a disciple, truly I say to you, but he will by no means lose his reward. Let's look at chapter 5. We'll read the first 5 verses. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance of the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. And the king said to her, What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even to the half of my kingdom. And Esther said, If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king. Then the king said, Bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther has asked. So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. Her fast is now complete. Some try to make the fast as not so severe. They claim it was only the rest of the day after the conversation with Mordecai, the whole day following, and the morning of the 3rd day. They point to Jesus' 3 days in the tomb as an example. I don't know. I'm going with the 3 whole days here. What happened in those 3 days? Well, it's unspoken, but probably Esther sought guidance from God in developing a plan. Esther now goes before the king. She no doubt has done everything she could to make herself attractive to Xerxes. After 3 days without food or water, she may have lost some significant weight and may have appeared gaunt. Think of how you may have looked after a prolonged illness, say a bout with the flu, for example. She accentuates her natural beauty with the striking dress and regalia of her royal robes. You can imagine that she stopped to gather herself. One last primp, run through a mental checklist, take a deep breath, right before she made the last turn or took the last step before she'd be visible to the king. If you remember the description of the palace, there was a courtyard to pass through and 2 doorways leading to the throne room through which the king could see anyone approaching. Additions to Esther in the Apocrypha, and work that's not inspired, gives a prayer she uttered before coming into his presence. She is about to appear, unsummoned, before the king of Persia, the man who literally holds the power of life or death over her in his hand. If he extends the golden scepter, she lives to work her plan. If not, she dies, and the death sentence over the Jews is still in place. One author thinks this scepter extending was not a rule in Persia, but it's even mentioned here in the Bible, and there are reliefs found in the royal palace at Persepolis depicting such. There's a little psychological play going on here. If she had sent word to Xerxes requesting an audience with him, he could have delayed her coming until a time convenient for him, something like talk to the royal scheduler and he'll work you in. Coming unannounced and simply standing before him gave the impression of something urgent. Surely she would not come knowing she could face death if it were not urgent. Also, he had not seen her in 30 days. Unexpectedly seeing his beautiful queen, whom he loved, would have jolted his senses and brought to the fore all the feelings he had for her, and this seems to have been the case. There was tremendous pressure on this young woman. Vashti had been deposed for not coming when she was summoned, and now Esther comes without being summoned. How old was Esther at this time? Well, she's been queen for about 5 years. The marrying age of a young woman in this culture was somewhere between 14 to 16, which puts them on par with the good folks of my home state of Tennessee. So she could have been as young as 19, probably no older than 25. She would want to exude confidence, but her stomach was churning and her knees were knocking. Both additions to Esther, again, not inspired, and the Septuagint, that's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, completed about 280 BC. Both said that she had with her 2 maidens, one to lean upon, possibly due to her weakened condition, and one to carry her train. She makes her appearance before the king, and she won favor in the king's eyes. Remember, finding favor implies passivity. Winning favor implies activity. She was doing something. As we said before, there was something about Esther. This is said about her every time she faces an unknown or challenging situation. With the eunuch during the preparations for the Queen of Persia competition, with the other girls taken to Susa, with all who saw her when she saw the king for the first time, and most importantly, when she approaches the king here. He, seated on his throne, sees her standing in the doorway and allows her entrance. She touches the tip of the scepter as an acknowledgement and show of submission. You can tell by the king's question that the 30 days since Esther has last seen him was not because she had fallen out of favor. His questions to her were not born from annoyance, but concern. What is it? The words used here in this Hebrew phrase are used in 2 other places in the Scripture. In Genesis 21:17, the angel of God calls to Hagar, "What troubles you?" And in Psalm 114:5, the psalmist says, "What ails you, O sea, that you flee?" So this wasn't, "What do you want? What now? I'm busy with matters of the kingdom." It was more, "What troubles you? What ails you? What's wrong, Queen Esther?" Additions to Esther, not inspired. The Septuagint and Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian, all make her entrance a little more dramatic. She makes herself visible to Xerxes. When he first looks up to see her, it's with a look of intense annoyance and anger. She grows pale and faints, falling on the maiden at her side. Xerxes springs to her side to comfort her, and when she has recovered, he asks, "What's the matter, Queen Esther?" She responds that when she saw him, she was overcome because she saw him as an angel of God and was fearful of his glory. And then she faints again. When she recovered the second time, the request for the banquet was made. The offer of up to half my kingdom, interestingly granted even before her request was made, is hyperbole, an exaggeration for effect, but it reveals the extent to which Xerxes was willing to go to please Esther. Herod made the same offer to Salome after she danced for him, leading to the beheading of John the Baptist in Mark 6. Although Herodotus records one such instance when Xerxes offered a female petitioner whatever she wanted. The woman asked for one of the royal robes that belonged to Queen Amestris, that's Queen Vashti. The fallout, according to Herodotus, was extremely unfavorable. Esther extends an invitation to a banquet she had prepared for the king, and she specifically includes Haman on this very selective guest list. Something like, we haven't seen each other in so long. Can we just have dinner tonight? And bring Haman. The king is more than willing to accept. He says, let's go right now. Go get Haman and let's go. Now, wait a minute. I thought the whole idea of risking her life to go to the king was to talk to him about that evil Haman, that's what she would call him later, that evil Haman's death penalty edict, and to plead for her people. Now she wants to have dinner with them both, Haman included? Isn't he the guy who issued the edict to kill all the Jews? Where's all this pleading of her case? Normally, the king and queen ate separately in their own sections of the palace. The king ate in small gatherings, usually with a small group of advisors or administrators, unless it was something like a state dinner. If it was a family meal, usually only the queen or queen mother would be there, no children. For the queen to invite the king to a meal was unusual. To invite another male guest was highly unusual. On this occasion, Esther specifically requests Haman's presence. Why? Well, there are a couple of thoughts here. One goes this way. At the banquet, in a more comfortable setting, she would be better able to gauge Xerxes' true attitude toward her. After the tender encounter when she first came to see him, I think that doubt was relieved. It would be a chance to soften up Xerxes a little in hopes of getting a favorable response to her true concern. By inviting Haman, Xerxes' top counselor, she would give the impression that the dinner is all that was planned. Surely she wouldn't speak of personal matters before Haman. It would also demonstrate to Haman that she was no threat to him. The other goes this way. Imagine you're Xerxes. You haven't seen Esther for a month. You're obviously pleased to see her. You know something's bothering her. You're anticipating an intimate dinner for the two wherein she will divulge her request. And then she asks that Haman be present. And you're wondering, why? One theory put forth is that she wanted to heighten the sense of curiosity in Xerxes, which she did, by bringing in a certain amount of intrigue into the situation, which she did. Another theory has her trying to build a little jealousy in Xerxes, to put him on edge, to spark just a little bit of distrust in Haman. Let's look at verses 6 through 8. As they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Esther answered, "My wish and my request, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my wish and to fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." They finished eating, and they're having after-dinner drinks. The meal would have been very long. Think of an 8-course meal. The banquet is almost over. This is her last chance to make a request to Xerxes. Xerxes asks a second time, again figuratively offering up to half the kingdom, and again, it shall be granted. Haman has got to be feeling good. He's the king's grand vizier, the king's primary advisor. He has the king's ear. Now he, alone in all the kingdom, is also the intimate confidant of the queen. He's about to hear a request so private that only the king could hear. Some have suggested that she had a master plan all figured out and was executing it to perfection. Some suggest that she had only a very broad plan. Certainly she wanted to expose Haman for the nasty creature he was and to plead for her people. But beyond that, she was doing a great deal of improvising. Maybe she knew the characters well enough to anticipate how they would react to different stimuli. Maybe she sensed that the timing for the request was not right. Maybe she was just playing it by ear. I don't know. But now the time has come. She must tell Xerxes something. Again, some think the delayed request was part of the plan. Others think she's still thinking how to broach the subject with Xerxes and blurted out the request for the second banquet as a delaying tactic while she figured things out. Whatever the case, the delay only added to the intrigue of the situation and heightened Xerxes' anticipation and desire to grant the request. The invitation to another banquet for Xerxes and Haman is extended. The Jewish Haggadah, that's a section of the rabbinical commentaries on the Old Testament contained within the Midrash, says that Haman thought the banquet was in his honor. You see, Esther couldn't feast with him alone, so she invited Xerxes as cover. On the dark side, one Jewish tradition has Esther being friendly to Haman to arouse jealousy within Xerxes to the extent that he would kill them both, Esther sacrificing herself for the Jewish people. Of course, if she did that, the edict would still be in place with the Jews still under a death sentence, requiring deliverance from another source. We, in hindsight, know the story and the outcome and therefore know why the second request was necessary. The day's delay is crucial to the events setting up Haman for his downfall. We'll finish the chapter beginning in verse 9. And Haman went out that day, joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. Then Haman said, Even Queen Esther let no one but me come to the king to the feast that she had prepared. And tomorrow also I am invited by her to another with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Then go jovially to the feast with the king. This idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. Haman leaves the banquet joyful and glad in heart. Glad and pleased in heart, happy and high spirits, various translations say. The same phrase is used in 1 Kings 8:66 to describe the mood of the Israelites as they left the dedication ceremony for Solomon's temple. On the 8th day, he sent the people away, and they blessed the king and went to their homes joyful and glad of heart for all the goodness that the Lord had shown to David his servant and to Israel his people. Joyful and glad of heart. And why not? He is the king and queen's confidant. He alone, at the queen's request, had dined with the king and queen, and another invitation extended the following day. He is close with the royal couple. Actually, he's overwhelmed by his own sense of self-importance. Upon leaving the banquet, Haman sees Mordecai. Mordecai has shed his sackcloth and ashes, or else he would not be back at the king's gate. In previous encounters, Mordecai refused to bow. This time, not only does he refuse to bow, but he doesn't even stand up to acknowledge Haman. He presents the picture of one confident and not in awe or afraid of his adversary. In contrast, we see just how fragile Haman's emotional condition is, from complete elation to complete deflation and wrath in just an instant. Haman is instantly filled with wrath once more. Remarkably, he restrains himself, knowing that soon he would be rid of Mordecai, along with all the Jews, for good. He heads home, calls his wife and his friends. He recounts to them all his glories, as if they didn't know, all of his riches, enough to offer Xerxes 10,000 talents of silver. His sons, all 10 of them. Herodotus tells us that next to prowess in arms, it was regarded as the greatest proof of manly excellence in Persia to be the father of many sons. He tells them of his promotions to second in the kingdom, his advancements over all the others. They were all commanded to bow before him. And to top it off, only he was invited by the queen to the royal banquet. And as proof of his success, the queen has invited him again tomorrow. Most commentaries have this scene as a bragging session, but I'm not sure. When we read the text, it's difficult to get the tone of voice a person might use. I think this could just as easily be a big pity party. Look at the circumstances leading up to it. He's riding an ego high after leaving the banquet. Life could not be better, joyful and glad in heart. He sees Mordecai at the king's gate and gets insulted more than ever before. As he leaves Mordecai at the gate, he does so full of wrath. I get the impression that he, like Popeye, would murmur to himself all the way home, Mordecai's insulted me again. He's ruining the entire evening, and so forth and so on. By the time he arrives home and everyone is gathered, his wrath could have become, or at least been accompanied with, depression. So maybe he was not saying in verse 11, and Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, how he had advanced above him, all the other officials of service of the king. And then Haman said, even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast, and tomorrow I am invited together with her with the king. It could have easily just been. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he advanced him above all the officials in the service of the king. Then Haman said, even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast she had prepared. And tomorrow also am I invited by her together with the king. If verses 11 and 12 are a boast, then verse 13 represents another massive mood change for Haman, which would not be unusual. If it's a pity rant, then verse 13 is a continuation of the rant. Whichever it is, I'm sure when he gets to Mordecai's name, it is forceful and with great anger. Yet all of this is worth nothing to me as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Mordecai the Jew. Those whom he had assembled were his yes men. He had determined in his mind what he wanted to do, kill Mordecai the Jew. Now they, especially his wife, provide support for him without thinking it through, and they offer a remedy. Then his wife Zeresh and all the friends said to him, let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hung upon it. There's an easy solution to this, Haman. Hang Mordecai. The gallows were not what we were used to seeing in the westerns. It would just been a spike for impaling. The great height may have been the height of the stake or the combined height of the city wall or a place within the city, but high enough so everyone could see. The Persians were masters at execution. Impaling was not just a way in which to kill someone. They, like the Romans who would follow them, had so perfected impaling that the victim could stay alive for hours on the stake. Sometimes you see etchings of executions performed by Vlad the Impaler, the inspiration for Dracula. The victim may have a spike through the stomach or the back or be folded over on the spike or something like that. The impaling performed by the Persians was up through the back, along the spine, exiting the neck behind the head, leaving the victim in an upright position. As with crucifixion, there was an element of mocking and embarrassment of the victim, an element of revenge in the execution. Various translations have Zeresh telling Haman to ask the king or suggest to the king that Mordecai be hung on the gallows. The true force of the word is tell the king. The thought being, you have influence with the king. Let him know there's one in the kingdom who is disobedient to the king's command. Don't mention that it's the command to bow down to Haman. Tell him this is not in his interest to allow this, just like you did before when you duped Xerxes. Tell him there are gallows prepared. Just say the word and I'll take care of it for you. One author suggested that Xerxes' proposal was made in jest or sarcastically, and even she was surprised when Haman accepted the proposal. You know the king so well. Just march right in there right now and tell Xerxes that the gallows is ready and Mordecai must be hung for not obeying the king. Haman impaled that troublesome Jew and then go happily to eat with the king. Oh, yes. What a splendid idea. So he orders the steak prepared for Mordecai. Well, that'll do it for chapter 5. Next time we'll look at chapter 6. Until then, may God bless you.